program. Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Susan Gladstone Pasternak, the very proud executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And I'm very, very happy to welcome you all this evening for this very special program with our former Miami resident and Temple Israel of Greater Miami member and FIU alum, Beco Lichtman, who's joining us all the way from Paris, where it's very late. And I very much appreciate that he agreed to do this at a time convenient for our American audience. So I'm really happy that we're able to do this particular program, which is the last in our series of programs of our Monday Night at the Museum series, focusing on Black lives in a Jewish context. On behalf of the Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Global Jewish Studies program, directed by Dr. Tudor Parfit, at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Tonight's program is titled Inclusion, a Vital Jewish Value, presented, of course, as we said, by Beco Lichtman. As a theater kid turned MBA, Beco appreciates the power of diverse representation across all industries. For more than a decade, he consulted with top global brands on challenges ranging from marketing and customer experiences to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now he's focused on helping museums, Jewish institutions, art organizations, and other nonprofits to integrate diversity-informed practices that enhance their cultural missions and enable staffers and supporters to bring their whole selves to their work. As I mentioned, he is a former Miami resident, and I'm so happy to see so many of his friends joining us here this evening. Throughout tonight's program, you are all encouraged to post questions on the chat, and we will save time at the end of the program for Luna Goldberg, our education manager, to be able to facilitate the question and answer period. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Beco Lichtman.
Wow, thank you so much. I first want to thank the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, for being bold enough to create the Black Lives in a Jewish Context series. Special thank you to Susan Gladstone, the executive director, for the invitation. In fact, last year, when I made the decision to focus my attention on diversity and inclusion, Susan was one of the first people to reach out to me. And so I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you. And special thanks also to Luna Goldberg and Nancy Cohen for making this all happen here tonight. We appreciate you. So it's been quite a year. And I just want to take a moment, because I know many of us we have Zoom fatigue. So I want you just to take in the people on the Zoom right now. If you're comfortable turning your camera on for a moment, great. If not, we understand. But it's just so wonderful to see so many familiar faces, some new faces here. We really appreciate you carving out the time to be here tonight. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Just a moment, please.
You did a nice setup there with the flowers.
Okay, so if you haven't already, be sure to mute yourselves where we don't hear any of the background noise there. Great. So anyhow, I want to go ahead and get started. I want to say many thanks to you all for coming out tonight. My family's here, my mom's here. Hi, Mom. And I'm sure many of you are thinking right now, thank goodness this is happening. No more emails from Beco about this program. For anyone who knows me well, you know that I'm not a fan of self-promotion. However, this work in diversity and inclusion is so important to me, and I wanted to make sure that anyone who was interested in participating tonight had the opportunity to do so. So thank you for your patience. I'd like to take a moment to talk about kavanah, excuse me. Kavanah is something that guides me when I'm praying or doing mitzvot, when I'm setting a new goal for myself, or when I'm serving my community. And so I want to take a moment right now to tell you what my kavanah, my intention is for the talk this evening. You know, I was thinking earlier that it's taken a long time for me to feel comfortable expressing my Blackness in a Jewish space. And not because of any shame of being Black, but rather, especially in the early days of being Jewish, I tried really hard to assimilate. And at that time, you know, there really wasn't a lot of diversity in some of the Jewish spaces that I was involved in. And so I think in some ways I felt like I had to check my Blackness at the door. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm happy to say now that I am comfortable expressing my Blackness in a Jewish space. And so this issue of diversity and inclusion is really near and dear to my heart. So tonight, I'd like to bring some awareness and address the lack of inclusion that we sometimes see in the Jewish community. I'd like to provide a perspective that perhaps you haven't considered before. And I'd like to propose some possible solutions so that all of us can help foster a more diverse and inclusive community. Most importantly, I would like us to find some common ground because there's so much discord in the world right now, which creates this noise, and it makes it very difficult for us to hear one another because we're often talking past each other, and then we end up retreating to our own corners without actually deepening our understanding of where the other person's coming from. So not tonight. Tonight, I want us all to come into the circle, to feel comfortable sharing. And I like to do that with compassion and understanding and respect, patience, perhaps a little forgiveness if need be, and skillful speech. So that is my intention for this evening. So I'd like to start with a bit of a glossary of terms because it's important that as I use certain terms this evening, that you understand exactly what I mean when I use it. Black Lives Matter. I know this term is very controversial for some people, but Black Lives Matter. Our lives matter. And I want to focus on the movement rather than the organization. Not that I have a problem with the organization, but I think sometimes it's easy for us to get hung up on politics and personalities rather than the movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement is focused on the human rights and dignity of Black people. That's it. The Black Lives Matter movement is not anti-law enforcement. The Black Lives Matter movement does not condone violence. And more recently, there have been some folks out there who I believe are trying to distract from the issue by suggesting that all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. We know that. We understand that. But it's at this particular moment in time where we believe that Black lives are at the most in jeopardy. And that's why we're trying to shine a light on this and raise some awareness. It's not that we don't know that all lives matter. I believe that when we undermine the movement, again, going back to human, human rights and the dignity of Black people, when we undermine that movement, it actually can lead to greater exclusion and potential violence against the Black community. Which is why I was absolutely delighted last year when more than 600 Jewish organizations stood up and said Black Lives Matter. Those 600 organizations collectively represent more than half of all American Jews. I mean, that's really impressive. And Dr. King said that no one is free until we're all are free. And this idea is quite profound, and we see it throughout Judaism. In its simplest form, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Hillel the Elder, his famous principle, said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. And a bit later, we'll be looking at some specific Jewish values that help support that argument. Next, we have diversity. So diversity is an appreciation and a respect for the differences across our community, ranging from race and religion and all of those things you see there on the screen. And there are others I haven't mentioned, including ideological diversity. I think it's important, and I embrace people who have different views. I'm not here to indoctrinate. I think it's okay for us to have different views, different solutions in terms of how we approach the problem. I do believe, however, that the more diversity we have, it allows us to move from a place of tolerance to a place of full acceptance and appreciation, which leads us to inclusion, which is the promotion of a culture where all people feel welcome and treated with respect. And so it's possible to have one without the other. So really we think of diversity is about representation and inclusion is about involvement. And belonging, this is one of my favorites. So belonging is when we feel like a valued and legitimate member of a group. When we feel like we can bring our authentic selves into a particular space. This is a little like what I was talking about.
Emilio,
I beg your pardon?
desgraciadamente,
I'm sorry, I think someone needs to mute themselves. So we want to bring our authentic selves into a space. So earlier I was speaking about my comfort in now expressing my Blackness in a Jewish space. This is what we want. We want people to feel like they can bring their whole selves into any space. I like to say that belonging is what happens when you get inclusion right. And that leads me to unconscious bias, which is unconscious bias, or also implicit biases, are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their conscious awareness. So I've done some research on this, and it's really quite fascinating. Our unconscious bias is more prevalent than our conscious prejudices. And in fact, our unconscious bias is often at odds with our conscious values. Unconscious bias generally happens when we're having to think very quickly and categorize, put people into social groups. And it creates this, without realizing, it creates perhaps our judgment, it impacts our judgment and our decisions. So I think a good example of this might be advertising. So we've all seen it. We've all seen some ad where we're thinking, wait, that seems kind of racist, right? And surely that ad team, they weren't sitting around the table thinking about how to make a racist ad. It often happens because it's the unconscious bias coming through. And then sometimes, particularly in those situations, you probably had a group of people who came from similar social backgrounds. So what happens when we're lacking diversity is sometimes we end up validating each other's blind spots. And so that's another reason why it's important to have diversity. Woke. We've been hearing a lot about woke these days, which refers to the sensitivity and awareness of issues that concern social and racial justice. I like to think of it as just having empathy for another person's plight. Again, I don't think this is particularly controversial. I think, it's just being aware of what someone else might be going through. Sadly, this term has been co-opted by some other groups to distort the definition. And it seems that these days that woke may go hand in hand with this idea of cancel culture, which refers to the popular practice of withdrawing support. So we often see it whether it be a famous person or a company, an organization that says or does something that we find offensive. And then now, particularly these days with social media, you know, there's a lot of people weighing in and suddenly we want to withdraw support. I think the cancel culture is really about accountability. I mean, we're free to say whatever we want, but there are consequences. What I will say is I do believe this idea of cancel culture is worthy of a larger discussion, because the truth of the matter is we all have said and done something stupid, right? And I think that what we need to do is to at least provide a path to redemption, which it doesn't seem like we're doing so much these days. I think a person should be able to eventually redeem themselves. So I certainly welcome those discussions, but I think in and of itself, I think cancel culture really comes down to accountability. So I'd like to shift a little bit now and tell you a little bit about my story and how I came to be here tonight with you all. So this is me, this little kid from the Park Heights area of Baltimore, came from a very loving family. You know, I often tell people that I wouldn't be who I am today had it not been for the love and sacrifice and guidance for my mother. And it was a period where, boy, I was a ham. I loved performing, incredibly curious, questioned everything. And I was looking to fit in like a lot of kids at that time. Didn't have the word for it, but I already knew that I was gay. And I think that that perhaps added to some of the angst that I was experiencing at that time. But again, very curious and wanted to know everything. And so interestingly, we used to drive on Saturdays up Park Heights Avenue to shop and run errands at a place called the Reisterstown Road Plaza. And as we were driving up Park Heights Avenue, we would drive by the JCC. There were, oh boy, there were several synagogues, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, all on this stretch of Park Heights. There were a couple of day schools. And I was so fascinated watching the Jews walk back and forth on Shabbat. I mean, this really was fascinating to me. I think a lot of it had to do with, you know, through this young lens, something about devotion and faith. Even though I had been exposed to it, I don't come from a particularly religious family. However, my grandmother was religious, Mary of blessed memory. She was the first person, I think, who introduced me to spirituality, because she would kind of drag me off to church, probably more often than I wanted. She belonged to a place called Bethel AME Church, and it was an African Methodist Episcopal church. It was very animated, just incredible music. It was this very beautiful sacred space. There was a mural in the background and people were dressed to the nines. And so there were certainly examples of faith and devotion, but this seemed different somehow. And I wanted to know more about it. Also, as I was watching the folks walk back and forth to temple and Shabbat, they were almost always in groups, like families. And that was very moving to me. I'm not sure why, but I found that very moving. And again, I didn't have the language for it, but there was a solidarity that appealed to me, and inclusion. It seemed very, very inclusive. So fast forward, we moved out to the suburbs, to a predominantly white neighborhood. It too had a very thriving Jewish community, perhaps a little bit more religiously liberal than what I had experienced in the Park Heights area. And I continued to explore Judaism. More and more of my friends were Jewish. In fact, I had my first Shabbat at my friend David's home. His mother was very generous with me in terms of sharing information and some of the rituals. And I remember like holding the kippah, and it was so exciting to me. I mean, there was something that really moved me. And again, I was very young, so I wasn't really thinking in terms of learning the way that we think of as an adult, but again, something very appealing, and the rituals. And as appealing as all of this was, I didn't actually see any Black Jews, with the exception of Sammy Davis Jr., of course. You know, Sammy was really quite something. You talk about representation, the importance of representation. There was something so powerful about seeing this Black man practicing Judaism. It was the only example I had of it. And this particular image with him holding and reading the Talmud it's really quite something. So what you don't know is this particular article was printed in Ebony magazine, actually long before I was born. But I mean, for those who don't know, Ebony is a magazine that's geared toward a Black audience. So this was really quite something, publishing this sort of article. And it inspired me in terms of having that sort of representation. And then, of course, when I found out that Babs was a part of the tribe, I'm like, where do I sign up? Obviously, this isn't why I converted to Judaism, but again, I was a kid and I loved Barbra Streisand, and it kind of fed into this whole thing of this tribe and what I perceived as the solidarity and the inclusion. But I'll share with you a little bit later how and why I ended up converting to Judaism. So now I'd like to just spend a little time talking about the relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. I think we're at a pivotal time, and I just want to back up to help us better understand how we got to where we are now. And so back in the 50s and 60s, there really was a camaraderie in many ways between the Black and Jewish community. This is a really wonderful image of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel. For those who don't know, Rabbi Heschel is the gentleman with the beard. And this is a photograph taken when they were marching in Birmingham, I believe in 1965. And this was a period where a lot of Jewish faith leaders were speaking out for racial equality. And there were a number of organizations on the national stage, including the NAACP, which of course had been formed many years before, but had been founded by Jews and Blacks. You had the American Jewish Congress, the Anti-Defamation League, and others who were working hard for racial equality. There were rabbis who were already starting to speak out for school integration, which, even though it was the right thing to do, it was quite brave because, again, it was not a particularly easy time to be Jewish in the 50s. And I think that a lot of folks were fearful of the backlash. But again, many of them were right there working alongside of other civil rights leaders like Dr. King. And interestingly, after doing a little research, I found out that Dr. King was very supportive of Israel. In fact, Dr. King said that Israel's right to exist was incontestable and that it's one of the great outposts of democracy in the world. And Dr. King actually signed on to a letter that was published in the New York Times called Moral Responsibility in the Middle East, which was a call to the United States to support the Freedom Israel. And this was in the days leading up to the Six-Day War. But I want to go back a little bit more into the 50s, because during that time, we were seeing a rise in anti-Semitism as well, in Jewish exclusion. The Ku Klux Klan was focusing its attention on both the Jewish and Black communities. Sadly, there were a series of dynamite bombings in Florida that targeted both the Black and the Jewish community. And so this camaraderie, this alliance was incredibly important. And then we had Dr. James Farmer. So Dr. James Farmer worked alongside Dr. King. He helped to organize the first Freedom Ride, and he co-founded CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which again was founded by Jews and Blacks, and it had a particularly strong presence in Florida. Again, we were seeing this sort of religious bigotry and racial hatred was becoming more and more intertwined during those years. In fact, Dr. Farmer was actually one of the folks who organized the first lunch counter sit-in in 1959 in Miami. And there were a group of Jews and Blacks who went into these, as well as white Christians, who went into these establishments demanding to be served. This particular photo was, it is from 1959, and it's either Burdines or Woolworth on Flagler. I'm not sure which one, but it's quite a powerful image. So if in fact there was this camaraderie between the Black and the Jewish community, why is there such a rift? Some believe that the unity that was displayed on the national stage unfortunately did not trickle down to the community level. And while there were a number of Jews who were in the front line of civil rights, there were some Jewish business owners that enforced segregation. So for instance, in Baltimore, there were a number of department stores, I think about 10 department stores in Baltimore in the 50s. And more than half of them were owned by Jews. And unfortunately, they enforced segregation, as well as some of the Jewish-owned hotels in Miami Beach. Also, the 60s, we saw the rise of Black power. And then there were some differences amongst the Blacks and Jews over affirmative action. And I think that helped to drive a wedge into the coalition. And I think with time, with misunderstanding and a breakdown in communication, there was an increase in Black anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-Black racism. And I believe that that fracture still exists today. And I think that it's been made worse in more recent years. And we have a lot of work to do and a lot of healing to do. And so again, I'd like to take you back to my story. So from Baltimore, I started traveling the world and I moved to Europe for many years. And I continued to explore Judaism along the way when I lived in Madrid, and then London, and then finally I ended up in Paris the first time. And then I landed in sunny Miami where I met and married my Bashert. That's my husband, Eric. We've been together for nearly 17 years. It's really quite something. Believe it or not, I did not convert for marriage, but I do have a funny story. So Eric had two cousins, Felice and Bernice, both of blessed memory. And Felice lived in Broward, and Bernice would come down and spend some portion of the winter in Palm Beach. And we'd go up once or twice a month and have lunch and hang out. And they were just amazing women, hilarious, outspoken, just really wonderful women. And so pretty early on, I should mention, they were about 90 years old when Eric and I first got together, thereabouts, maybe a little younger. And Eric had mentioned, I think, early on that, oh, by the way, Beco is converting. And Bernice, she looks at me quizzically and she says, so you're Black and you're gay and you want to be Jewish? I said, yeah. She's like, what? You don't have enough problems? Oh, we really miss them. They really, amazing people. And talk about inclusive. Bernice had this ability to just pull people in with her charm. And in all of those years that I got to know her, I never felt like I was any different than any other member of the family. And so I really appreciated that. So why did I become a Jew? Judaism encourages this freedom of thought that I hadn't experienced before. It taught me that it was okay to grapple with difficult spiritual questions. I was attracted to its commitment to social justice. The emphasis on the value of community. I think going back to those childhood images I had of the Jewish community, that's really appealing to me. And when I converted, it was, it's a process. It was a really beautiful process. And at the end, there are a number of rituals, included the mikvah, which I did at the ocean with my rabbi and my husband, which was just incredibly moving. And then there is a more public ceremony. And I remember being on the bima, and there are a number of things that you're encouraged to say. And I remember the part about joining all of Am Yisrael, this idea of joining the people of Israel. It's so moving to me, and it still is moving to me, this opportunity to feel connected and included. And I still feel that way, when, these wonderful learning opportunities, or when I'm engaging in certain rituals. And so that's some of the reasons why I chose to become a Jew. So now I'd like to look at 5 values that I believe are deeply embedded in who we are as Jews, and underscore the importance of inclusion in our community. The first is kavod, which means to honor, respect. Specifically, it's honoring the dignity of every person. And interestingly, kavod doesn't refer to a feeling. It's a behavior. In other words, it doesn't matter how I feel about the person. It means that I just simply have to honor the dignity of this person. In this particular case, respect isn't earned. It's just simply given because they're human. And as Jews, we're taught to accept others without any prejudice or bias. And the Torah states that, to love your fellows as yourself. And in the Talmud, we learn that we're all descendants from a single person. And so no one's ancestor is better than the next. And so how can I possibly embrace this particular Jewish value without being inclusive? How can I honor the dignity of every human being without being inclusive? I can't. The next one is tzedek. Tzedek is often confused with tzedakah. We all know tzedakah, right? This idea of charity and giving to people who are less fortunate. Sometimes it's a box in the back of the shul. Tzedek is a little different. Tzedek is about, as I see it, it's about fairness, and it's about creating a better world by changing the systems and structures that keep people in these stuck places. In other words, let's say that I give to an organization that helps the homeless. That's tzedakah, that's charity. Tzedek is looking at, well, why does this exist? Why does this problem of homelessness exist? And of course, there are many reasons. But I might think that access to education may be one of the reasons. So tzedek would be doing what I can to improve the system so folks have more access to education. And so really, it's a religious obligation to do what's just and right. And again, how can I be fair, just, or righteous if I'm not being inclusive? The next is Gemilut Hasadim. Unlike tzedek, Gemilut Hasadim is voluntary. It's acts of kindness. You know, we do it simply because it's kind, with no expectation of getting anything in return. Shemen the Just, who's a key historical figure in Judaism because he was the first person named in Pirkei Avot after the prophets. So he kind of represents this shift between the prophets and the rabbis. So those who receive the word of God versus those who interpret it. And his most famous teaching states that there are three pillars of Judaism upon which the whole world depends. No pressure. The first is Torah, the second is temple service, and the third is Gemilut Hasadim. And that says a lot. And again, how can I fulfill these values if I'm not being inclusive? I also want to share for a moment, it's interesting when we speak about loving kindness, meditation, Vipassana meditation is very important to my life, and it's rooted in Buddhist teachings. And there's a particular practice that focuses on loving kindness, and it's called metta, which comes from the Pali language. And, you know, particularly when you're just starting out, you're encouraged to practice loving kindness on someone that you care about, someone that you know and care about, because it's pretty easy. But I would actually encourage all of us to engage in the practice of Gemilut Hasadim with someone we don't know, with a stranger. Because I believe that welcoming the stranger is also an act of kindness. And certainly as Jews, we know the importance of welcoming the stranger. And so next, we have Selam Elohim. This is my favorite. It's a hallmark of Judaism. It essentially says that each of us are made Selam Elohim, in the image of God. That each of us are dear to God, that we're worthy, unique, and equal, and that every human being that ever was and ever will be was made Selam Elohim. I believe this particular value honors our interconnectedness. And so I think it's impossible to embrace this without being inclusive. And I should say, for the record, that these are all things that I strive for each day, and sometimes I fail. And with Selam Elohim, it's important, particularly when I'm dealing with difficult people, to remember that this person too was made in the image of God. And that helps me to be a little bit more inclusive as well. And finally, we have Takunalam. This is one that many of us are familiar with, which translates to repair the world. At the end of the Aleinu prayer, there's this reference to perfecting the world. I find this language all very interesting, but perfecting the world, which again, we translate into repairing the world. And I believe that inclusion is the low-hanging fruit. That is such an easy thing to do. Again, we're just asked to leave this world a little better than the way we found it. And that's such an easy thing to do, to be inclusive. And it reminds me of another teaching that states that we are not obligated to complete the work, but nor are we free to desist from it. And that's a good reminder of Takunalam. And so again, by simply treating people with dignity, being just and fair, performing these acts of kindness, remembering that we're made in the image of God, all of us, and doing our part to repair the world, not only are we doing mitzvot, but we have an opportunity to be inclusive. Not just within the Jewish community, but the larger community as well. So I want to look at some ways that we can be more inclusive. And this is an area when I normally work with groups, I'd be focused a little bit more on an organization. But tonight, I wanted to provide a few tips that would be useful to both individuals as well as organizations. Pardon me. So to integrate D&I being diversity and inclusion, into your core values. So oftentimes organizations, they're well-meaning and they want to make some sort of effort in this area, but they perhaps delegate to a person to kind of work on D&I. And it's kind of operating over here in a silo, when in fact, we should be doing everything we can to kind of weave it throughout the culture of the organization, so it's reflected throughout, not just this thing that's kind of functioning over here. The same is true as individuals. So it's difficult to say that I'm for social justice, but in my day-to-day, I'm not embracing the concept of diversity and inclusion. It's often easy, for instance, when I'm in shul or if I'm in a Jewish space, kind of do the right thing, but what happens once I leave that space? What happens when I'm at Publix or Whole Foods or I'm just running errands and I'm encountering different people? How am I treating those people? That's important for us to remember. Next, we have become an ally. So there's a wonderful website out there that provides some really great tips on how to become an ally. And I borrowed one or two that I'd like to share with you. And the one is to take the struggle on as if it's your own. I think that's really important. We can't just stand on the sidelines. We've got to get in there, roll up our sleeves, and act like this is our own struggle as well. As Jews, we know what it's like to be persecuted. We know what it's like to be targeted. We know what it feels to be a marginalized group. And that's all the more reason for us to jump in there and help other groups who are still suffering. Another one is to transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. White privilege, another term that seems to be controversial. And I know that it's uncomfortable to look at, but I think it's important that the truth of the matter is we all don't come in this world equal in terms of the way our society is designed. And so when you are white, you do have some privilege. And so the hope is that you would use that to amplify the voices of the people who are again, are still suffering. And lastly, acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you. And so just very briefly, I was in a meditation retreat just before COVID in San Francisco. There were maybe 50 or 60 of us in a room. And one of the teachers was sharing some information. She was reading a quote, and the quote, it included a number of things, but there was something insensitive about enslaved peoples. I remember thinking, that's a little insensitive. I didn't feel particularly offended because I understand that she was reading from something. I don't believe that she was aware that this was insensitive. I really didn't think anything of it. The next day, we come back into space. We're continuing on with the retreat, and the teachers announced that someone had written a note anonymously. So I'm thinking, oh boy. As it happens, I was the only Black person in the room. I felt like all the eyes were on me, thinking I'd written the note. So I just said, I didn't write it. And then the person who wrote the note actually identified herself. And there was an interesting discussion. And it was a real opportunity there, a real learning opportunity for all of us. However, the teacher, again, she was well-meaning, but she made it about herself. She was, deeply offended that someone could think that she was being insensitive or that she could possibly be racist and that she'd been an ally. And so somehow we were no longer talking about the offensive text and maybe reconsidering whether or not we would use this. And instead, we were talking about her. And I think that's important when we're trying to shine a light on a problem. Let's not make it about us. And next, we have practice inclusive leadership. So I just want to emphasize, we don't need a title to be a leader. Each of us as individuals can be leaders in our community, and we can simply commit to treating every member of our community equally. We can have self-awareness. So earlier we spoke about this unconscious bias. So I think a part the self-awareness is just simply knowing that this thing exists. And someone had asked a few days ago, well, how do we overcome unconscious bias? That's a great question. It's not an easy thing, but one way is by creating more diversity, engaging in discussions with people from dissimilar social backgrounds. And we also want to have some humility. And then we have this idea of being open to the idea of being uncomfortable. So I believe that what we're doing right here, right now, it may be a little uncomfortable for some people, but that's a good thing. The hope is that we're learning, there's some new ideas here, that some of those preconceived notions are being challenged in some way. So I think that the more opportunities we have to do this, the better it is for all of us. And finally, listen. As I mentioned earlier, there's so much noise going on and it's very difficult to hear each other. And so I encourage each of us to listen where we can learn from our neighbor and hopefully be better and more inclusive. So I thank you so much. And I'd like to open this up. Luna, I believe that you're going to help with this, but I just want to say, I encourage really honest and frank questions and comments. I like to think this is a really safe space for us, so no questions are off limits.
Thank you, Beco, for sharing your story and sharing these different ways that we can practice being inclusive as a community, as an organization as well. And we have gotten a few questions in the chat. Please feel free to add as we go. So the first question we received is about your experience now having been in France and coming from the US. And our audience member would like to know how it's been different for you, life in these different places.
Yeah, I was just speaking to a friend about this a few days ago. So being a Jew in France is very different than being a Jew in Miami. Obviously, there's a different history here. So one of the things that we found is folks are a little bit more hesitant to talk about being Jewish. And so it's been a little bit more challenging to build community in the way that we had in Miami. Miami is an incredibly thriving Jewish community, very rich Jewish community, very diverse in many ways. It's not that the Jewish community isn't diverse here. In fact, one of the shuls that we've been to is incredibly diverse. I'd actually never seen so many Jews of color in a single space before. Families, young people, older people. It was really incredible. But I would say generally, building community is more within the Jewish community is more challenging here in France than it's been in the United States. I know that a lot of folks are concerned about anti-Semitism here in France. Yes, it exists, no doubt. However, our experience thus far is not as bad as perhaps some of our friends believe it is. I mean, it's anti-Semitism is bad, of course, but we've not been the target of that. We don't know anyone personally who's been the target. I will say that it's much more subtle. So, for instance, people don't look at me and think that I'm Jewish. So I often have this opportunity to hear this sort of unfiltered opinion. And so there's one gentleman in particular, we were having a discussion and religion came up. And when he referred to Judaism, it wasn't overt bigotry, but he started using terms like power and lobbying and money and you could feel there was a little disdain for the community. And so it's subtle like that. Of course, more recently, there was a woman who was murdered here, and the gentleman was deemed not responsible because he had been smoking marijuana. And so that, of course, is very upsetting. And so there's a lot of work that's needed here as well. A lot of work. And frankly, Paris is our home now, but we very much miss our Miami Jewish community. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Our next question is about diversity and how you see these diversity issues in Israel.
I wholeheartedly support Israel. Let me just be clear about that. But I think a lot of work is needed there as well, particularly around the issues of diversity. I know that there's some issues. I think what I'd like to do is not delve too deeply into politics. What I've found in more recent years is the moment that we start discussing politics, we start choosing a side. So I will say that I support Israel. However, more work is needed there as well when it comes to diversity.
Thank you. Our next question, and these are big questions, I have to say. So our next one is, how can we heal the breach between Jews and African Americans?
We need to communicate more. As I mentioned in the talk, this idea of listening. So a lot of what I shared tonight was geared toward inclusion within the Jewish community and looking at some of the bias perhaps toward the Black community. But no doubt that anti-Semitism is unfortunately a problem in some pockets of the Black community. And so I think we should do more to create these sort of opportunities to come together and actually listen to each other. Again, we're two marginalized groups and we do share quite a bit in common. And the hope is that we can actually begin that healing. And I think that that happens on the community level. Briefly, when we lived in Miami, I know that during my time at Temple Israel, at least once or twice a year, I felt like, we get a faith leader in, there was some sort of effort to bring the communities together. And I would love to see more of that.
Wonderful. So this question also brings us to another we have from Pamela. who asks, what to you are the magic connectors that can bring together as one people who come from very different backgrounds, beliefs, life history, and living in divergent countries?
Oh, you, Pamela. Pamela's a friend, and actually we're related, and that's for another day, and she's actually here in Paris. I think that's a great question. I think when we come together and we let ourselves become vulnerable and we self-disclose, I think it helps to break down those walls. Yeah, that's a big question, but I think coming together, listening, becoming vulnerable with one another, I think sharing the pain, that's something that's very difficult for people to do, to share the trauma. I think both in the Black and the Jewish communities, we have this generational trauma that's kind of been passed down. You know, in the Jewish community, it's from the Holocaust, and that's kind of passed down from one generation to the next. In the Black community, we see it because of slavery and Jim Crow. And I think that oftentimes we express the pain through anger. And I think if we're able to kind of let that wall down and show others what we're feeling, I think that always, in my experience, it's a great way to try to come together and build.
Thank you. We're gonna have one last question before I invite our executive director, Susan Gladstone Pasternak, up. And I know we talked about not getting political, but I do think this one is maybe more strategic. So this question is from Diane King, who asked, how do you respond to those who claim that Black Lives Matter and Black racial equality is reverse racism?
It's not true. It's not true. Again, as I mentioned, we know that all lives matter. We know that the lives of white people and those in the Latinx community and and Asians, particularly, we know that all lives matter. This isn't about reverse racism. This is simply about the dignity of Black people. There's no denying the history that we've had in the United States and beyond. And so we're just simply wanting to be recognized. We're wanting to feel safe. We want to feel that our lives are not going to be taken at the drop of a dime. So this isn't about reverse racism. And I feel like I need to say this. I never want any white person to feel guilty for being white. That's not what this work is about. It is absolutely not about that. I'm not getting into discussions about reparations. This is simply about the human rights and dignity of Black people. That's it. If you're white and in the Jewish community, if you have come from a white Ashkenazi background, embrace that. It's beautiful. We want to embrace it with you, but we want to embrace all Jewish identities. And then beyond the Jewish community, we want to be able to embrace all of our differences. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move to our closing, we do have a question I want to get to. You referred to a website about helping people become allies.
Yes.
Would you be able to share that with us?
Yes, just give me one moment.
Fantastic. That would be great.
In fact, if you want to continue, I'll go ahead and I'll put it into the chat box.
Wonderful. So I'm going to invite Susan Gladstone Pasternak up to close this evening's program. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. They're all fabulous, and I know we could go on for many, many hours, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for such an insightful and particularly passionate the way you sharing of your story with us. I was very moved, not only by what you said, but the way in which you let us see your passion for the topic. So thank you very much. And I just want to share with everyone one story from the history of Jews in Florida that I think relates to some of what you were talking about. One very prominent member of the Jewish community in Florida was Senator Richard Stone, whose son Elliot Stone serves on our board. His grandfather came to Miami Beach in 1929 and could not find a hotel that would allow Jews. He had a very hard time. So he built one. He built the Blackstone Hotel on Washington Avenue around 10th Street so that other Jews who came to Miami would not have such a hard time. By the 1950s, his son, Senator Stone's father, had taken over the hotel. And the AME Church, and this is why I wanted to mention it because you mentioned your connection, wanted to have a convention in Miami or Miami Beach. And there were no Black-owned hotels that could hold that number of guests, several hundred guests. So the Stone family, having had their own experience of not being able to get into a hotel, offered the Blackstone Hotel to the AME Church. And it was the first time that this edict that was really quite oppressive at the time, which stated that no Black person was allowed to spend the night on Miami Beach, was broken. So I just wanted to share that because you mentioned hotels and you mentioned the church, and there's an interesting connection. So I also want to share with all of you that we are open, and we have a beautifully reinvented look at the synagogue. We very much are curating the building itself, the original synagogue that houses our museum. We would love you to come and see it. We are open Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. You can go on our website to pick an appointment time, and we would love to show you. Some of you have come already, for which we're very grateful. And another thing I want to mention, again, relevant to something you said in your talk, is we are getting a wonderful exhibition in October. We will have it for 4 months. It was created at Temple Emmanuel in New York City, and it wasn't planning to travel anywhere. And I was able to convince them that we need it here in Miami Beach. And it's called Hello Gorgeous, and it's the life and times of Barbra Streisand. So we will have that exhibit in person in the museum from mid-October to mid-February. So please stay tuned, and please plan to come visit us during that exhibition. In closing, I'd like to just thank our co-sponsors, the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Global Jewish Studies Program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Luna, I hope you'll put our website into the chat where you can look at all of our upcoming activities, as well as make appointments to come and visit us. And again, to Beco in Paris, thank you so much for a very, very interesting, insightful experience this evening.
Thank you.
And with that, I wish you all a good night. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.